In this episode, I will be speaking with my colleague David about a key aspect of business continuity, supply chain resilience. When considering business continuity, sites may default to thinking about site-specific actions that work solely through internal mechanisms. However, establishing robust supply chain resiliency at a site involves more than what the site does for contingency planning in the event of disruptions. It also depends on the standalone reliability of suppliers and the effectiveness of the interactions between site and supplier. So, David, when sites plan for disruptions to their supply chain, especially for those critical starting materials, what basic factors should be considered and implemented?
Well, there's some things that they definitely should be considering, and that's alternative suppliers, safety stocks, risk assessment of all the starting materials, especially and including critical ones. In the case of alternative suppliers for all critical starting materials, they should establish, or sites should establish, having alternate suppliers. A lot of them tend to, as you all know, they tend to just stick to the primary supplier without identifying, any secondary suppliers. And, as we've seen, especially in 2020, all the disruptions with the supply chain, it definitely had an impact on suppliers in maintaining their stock supply. So, and when I mean stock supply, they should be having, you know, a supply more than what is needed for, let's say, one particular run. They should be able to, at least have, like a certain amount of stock supply available just in case there might be travel disruptions, transportation disruptions, weather disruptions. I mean, you name it. Anything can happen as we've seen in 2020.
Right, of course. But then once sites have established these policies, or perhaps they're reviewing previously established policies and procedures for their contingency planning, what obstacles have you observed come up most frequently, and how should sites respond in resolving those?
What I've seen in my past and what I continue to see is just sites with, having a lack or of defined processes in place. So, that many of them, they don't have, when they're building in their contingency plans, they're basically just relying on past history and not developing their contingency plans based on continual improvement. In the case of having clear defined supplier disruptions. So what, have they identified those? And if they have they been able to assess those and then put those plans into their contingency plans to ensure continual supply chain non-disruptions? As we've seen in the past, especially in 2020, again, they didn't have the right mechanisms in place to be able to handle things like that.
Right, of course. And that is absolutely vital in order to continue operating. Then, if sites have developed relatively sound baseline protocols and they've avoided pitfalls for supply chain resilience, what then can they do to progress to best practices?
Yeah, there's a lot of things they can do. One in particular that's very important. Once they've been able to establish their secondary suppliers, what they should do is start then rotating the primary and secondary suppliers, so that way they can ensure that the efficiency of their secondary suppliers are optimal just as much as their primary suppliers. In that case, because if they continue to use their primary supplier and not rotate in their secondary supplier, then they truly don't have any mechanisms to evaluate whether the secondary supplier can meet their expectations. A lot of other things, that sites need to do is rely on better performance evaluations of their suppliers, whether that's through ongoing performance reviews or ongoing on-site or virtual assessments. Those are some of the key things that they can put in place as well.
Right, of course, especially that periodic rotation of suppliers. That's an absolutely critical one for sure. Then, when we move past the site's contingency plans, because obviously you would hope that a site does not have to use their contingency plan for disruptions very often. The next aspect of this concept of supply chain resiliency is how sites are evaluating and selecting their suppliers. So, what key aspects of that process are most crucial for sites?
Well, again, like I alluded just recently was on-site and virtual assessments, right? So with being able to have continual communication with your suppliers, albeit through on-site or virtual inspections, these sites are able to determine moving forward whether that particular supplier is capable of meeting their expectations. If not, then they can seek suppliers, from with other companies. Other things they can rely on is regulatory history of the suppliers, by reviewing the regulatory histories with the FDA or any other regulatory agencies. All that information is there for everyone to use. So why not use it, to your advantage to be able to, establish whether that supplier is going to continue to provide and meet your expectations. Other things are your performance metrics, on-time deliveries, looking at things like that, looking at how many times, that supplier has had disruptions in meeting the expectations of your company. That's another thing to look at. So there's tons of information out there. It's just a matter, seeking it and using it to your advantage.
Right, of course. And you've made a good point there on the use of that public information and how sites can really take that and optimize that when they are considering which suppliers they should select and move forward with. But then when sites are considering how to optimize this process, how do you feel they can maximize the return of their investment in these suppliers once they have been selected?
There's certain things you can adopt as far as your practices are concerned. And that's just implement continuous improvement initiatives for the supplier program. And that's basically just making sure that you have a continual communication with your external suppliers, as well as your internal partners, such as procurement, quality, and management and operations. So with that, with the continual communication, you're able to track and analyze the metrics and evaluate the program effectiveness, not only internally, but also with your suppliers as well. So that way they understand exactly the expectations that their customers are asking for. And so that way, then the suppliers can then implement any improvements on their end.
Right, of course. And especially that aspect of evaluating for effectiveness is incredibly crucial because sites can absolutely have these policies, procedures, programs in place, but if they're not periodically evaluating whether they're effective, then why even have them at all?
That's true.
So then, once a site has determined a supplier to be satisfactory, we do have that monitoring and assessing process for supplier performance, and that's a vital part of the supply chain resilience. What are some of the details that site should be doing in that area for ownership of monitoring supplier performance?
Yeah, a lot of things, and I've alluded to some of them already. Establishing effective KPIs, key performance indicators that'll determine, a lot of things. Inequality issues, any transportation issues, any disruptions in service of any kind, on-time delivery, your incoming raw material inspections. That's a key indicator for when we're receiving, or any company for that matter is receiving materials from a supplier. By utilizing the incoming raw material information, they're able to determine the effectiveness of that supplier in regards to, packages being damaged, contents inside the package being damaged, things of that nature. So by being able to keep a good metric on those, actually determines whether or not that supplier is meeting your expectations. Also utilizing quality control tools such as CPK and PPK. And that way, and we're talking about process capabilities and process performances for each of the suppliers. And you're also, clear defined actions in response to any supplier performance. With that in mind, if a supplier is not meeting your performance, you want to be able to reach out to that supplier openly and communicate the issues that you're having. So that way, the supplier then understands that things need to be put into place in order to correct those issues.
Right, of course. Actions taken in response to poor supplier performance are very critical. And then also, if a site wants to truly be very mature in this area. They can also consider how they can proactively reach out to their suppliers and say, hey, here are some things that we would ask that you consider to do to bring your performance to a new level and not just always be reactive when they perform poorly.
Yeah, kind of consider it like a friendship, right? You want to have an open communication and be able to express, your needs as well as the needs of the supplier, as well as them communicating, on their end, to their customers exactly what's going on. So
Of course. And then that way everybody wins.
yeah, exactly.
Thank you, David, for your insight on supply chain resilience within pharma manufacturing sites. It's important for us all to remember that although sites have many internal responsibilities, a true supply chain resilience is achieved not just through on-site operations and that contingency planning, but also through the supplier operations and supplier quality management as well. Thanks everyone for listening, and if you found today's episode valuable, other episodes and our QMM articles can be accessed on the Shabas Solutions website, where you can also further explore our QMM services. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter and follow Shabas Solutions on LinkedIn to be notified of future episodes and industry updates.